A persistent sense of fatigue can remain even after you have stopped working, creating a disconnect between rest and recovery. You may step away from tasks, reduce external demands, and give yourself time to pause. Yet the expected feeling of renewal does not fully arrive. Instead of clarity or restored energy, there is often a dull heaviness that continues beneath the surface. This experience can feel difficult to explain, because from the outside, it appears that you have done what should be enough. The time has been taken, the activity has been reduced, and nothing immediate is requiring effort. Yet internally, something has not shifted in the way you expected. This is where the misunderstanding begins. Rest is often treated as the absence of activity, but recovery depends on whether the system has actually moved out of a state of activation. If the internal state remains unchanged, stopping external activity does not automatically create restoration. The body may be still, but the system may still be operating as if something requires attention. This can appear in subtle ways. The mind continues to process, anticipate, or hold on to unresolved tension, even without a clear focus. Because of this, the experience of rest becomes partial. There is a pause in action, but not a full release in the system. This is why the fatigue remains, not because rest was insufficient, but because the system did not fully transition into recovery. The difference between rest and recovery is not defined by what you stop doing, but by the state your system is able to enter afterward. You can remove external demands and still remain internally active, which means the system has not shifted into a condition that allows restoration. Recovery requires a change in how the nervous system is operating, not just a reduction in activity. When the system is in a state of activation, it prioritizes awareness, responsiveness, and readiness. These functions consume energy continuously, even when there is nothing immediate that requires action. If this state remains active during periods of rest, the body does not fully transition into a mode where energy can be restored. This is why you can feel tired even after doing nothing. The system has not been given the conditions it needs to reduce its internal workload. Instead of entering a state of recovery, it remains partially engaged, maintaining a level of tension that prevents full restoration. This can happen without obvious signs. There may be no clear stressor, yet the system behaves as if something still needs attention. Because of this, the absence of activity does not produce the expected result. Recovery is not simply about stopping, but about allowing the system to shift into a different mode of operation. Without that shift, rest remains incomplete. A system does not remain activated without reason, yet the reason is often not a single event that can be easily identified. In many cases, the body has adapted to repeated stress, constant mental engagement, or prolonged emotional pressure in ways that continue even after the immediate demands have passed. When activation has been frequent for a long period, The nervous system can begin to treat that state as familiar. What is familiar is not always healthy, but it is often what the system returns to most easily. This is why tension can remain present even during rest. The external pressure may be gone, but the internal pattern that developed around that pressure continues to operate. Your system has learned to remain prepared, and that preparation does not disappear the moment the day becomes quiet. It can continue through subtle muscle tension, background alertness, shallow recovery, or a mind that never fully stops scanning. These responses are not dramatic on their own, yet together they prevent the deeper settling that recovery requires. The body may be still, but stillness is not the same as safety to a system that has been trained to expect ongoing demand. Because of this, rest can feel physically present, but internally incomplete. The system pauses at the surface, while remaining partially mobilized underneath. This is how recovery becomes blocked, not through one obvious problem, but through a pattern of activation that has not yet learned how to fully stand down. When this pattern continues, the system does not remain in a temporary state of activation, but begins to reorganize itself around it. What was once a response becomes a baseline. This shift is subtle, because it does not feel like a constant surge of stress, but rather a quiet background tension that never fully leaves. Over time, the system starts to treat this level of activation as normal, even though it is higher than what true recovery requires. Because this change happens gradually, it is rarely recognized as a shift. It feels like your natural state, rather than the result of accumulated conditions. This is where fatigue becomes more persistent. Energy is no longer being used only when necessary, but is being consumed continuously at a low level. The system remains partially engaged, even when nothing demands it. This ongoing activation reduces the depth of recovery that can occur during rest. Instead of fully resetting, the system only reduces its intensity slightly, never reaching a point of complete restoration. This creates a cycle where you begin each day with less available energy than before. The difference may not be dramatic at first, but it accumulates over time. As the baseline shifts, what once felt like mild fatigue can begin to feel like a constant state. This is how chronic exhaustion develops, not from a single cause, but from a system that no longer returns to a fully recovered state. As this condition continues, a noticeable shift begins to occur in how rest is experienced. Instead of feeling restorative, rest can start to feel ineffective or even slightly frustrating. You may find yourself stepping away from activity, expecting some level of recovery, only to notice that the underlying fatigue remains unchanged. This creates a sense that rest is not working in the way it should. However, the issue is not with rest itself, but with the state in which rest is taking place. When the system has not fully disengaged from activation, the body is still using energy, even in the absence of visible effort. This leads to a situation where you are not actively doing anything, yet you are also not fully recovering. Over time, this creates a compounding effect. Each period of incomplete recovery carries into the next cycle of activity. You begin the day with slightly less energy, and by the end of it, the gap becomes more noticeable. This pattern repeats, gradually lowering the overall level of available energy. Because the change is incremental, it can be difficult to identify when the shift began. It does not feel like a sudden drop, but rather a slow decline that becomes more apparent only after it has already progressed. This is how fatigue becomes persistent, not through a single cause, but through repeated cycles where recovery never fully completes. A natural response to this ongoing fatigue is the belief that more rest will eventually resolve the problem. When energy feels low, it seems logical to reduce activity further, as if the system simply needs more time to recover. This assumption feels correct because in many situations, rest does restore energy. However, in this structure, the issue is not the quantity of rest, but the quality of the state during that rest. If the system remains partially activated, increasing the amount of time spent resting does not necessarily lead to deeper recovery. Instead, it can create a cycle where you continue to pause without experiencing the expected improvement. This leads to a repeated pattern. Fatigue appears, rest is increased, recovery does not fully occur, and the same level of fatigue returns. Because the result does not match the expectation, it can feel like something is missing or not being done correctly. In reality, the structure has not changed. The system is still operating in a way that prevents full restoration, regardless of how much time is allocated to rest. This is why the solution begins to feel unclear. More rest does not produce a different outcome, because the underlying condition remains the same. The pattern continues, not due to a lack of effort, but because the approach is focused on time rather than state. A difficult part of this experience is that the fatigue can remain present even when your body has not been doing very much. You may spend less energy physically, reduce your workload, and avoid obvious strain, yet the exhaustion still feels real and persistent. This is where mental fatigue begins to resemble physical tiredness. The body does not always distinguish clearly between visible effort and prolonged internal load. If the mind has been processing continuously, holding tension, or remaining in a state of low-level alertness, the system still pays an energetic cost. That cost may not look dramatic from the outside, but it accumulates in a way that affects how your body feels. This is why exhaustion can seem disproportionate to what you actually did. The fatigue is not coming only from action, but from sustained internal demand. When attention has been engaged for too long without full recovery, The body begins to carry that condition as if it were ongoing work. This creates a confusing experience. You feel physically drained, yet cannot always point to the kind of effort that would normally explain it. What is being felt is the result of a system that has remained active for too long, even when the activity was largely invisible. This is why the problem can feel so difficult to justify while still being completely real. As this fatigue continues, it does not remain limited to physical energy, but begins to affect how you think and feel. Concentration becomes less stable, not because the task has changed, but because the system no longer has the same level of available resources. Holding attention requires energy, and when that energy is reduced, the mind shifts more easily, struggling to stay with a single point for long. This can create a sense of mental heaviness, where even simple tasks feel more demanding than they should. At the same time, emotional recovery becomes slower. Situations that would normally pass without much impact can linger longer because the system does not reset as quickly. This is not due to the intensity of the situation, but due to the reduced capacity of the system to process and release it. As a result, both cognitive and emotional functions begin to narrow. You may find yourself avoiding effort, not out of preference, but because the system no longer supports sustained engagement. This gradually reduces the range of what feels manageable. Tasks become smaller, decisions feel heavier, and the overall sense of capacity begins to shrink. The fatigue is no longer just a feeling, but something that shapes how you move through your day. This is how chronic exhaustion begins to affect the structure of daily life, not by stopping activity entirely, but by quietly limiting what feels possible. What makes this state especially difficult is that it can begin to sustain itself, even when the original pressure has already decreased. The system is no longer responding only to current demands, but to the accumulated effects of reduced recovery, lowered energy, and ongoing internal strain. Because energy is limited, everything begins to require more effort. That increased effort creates additional stress on the system, even during ordinary tasks that once felt manageable. As a result, the body and mind spend more energy simply trying to function at a normal level. This leaves even less capacity available for actual recovery. A cycle starts to form. Fatigue reduces resilience. Lower resilience makes daily demands feel heavier, and heavier demands consume the little energy that remained. Nothing in this sequence needs to be dramatic for the pattern to continue. Small amounts of unreleased tension repeated across days can be enough to keep the system from fully resetting. This is why the fatigue often feels self-perpetuating. You rest, but the system is already carrying too much unresolved load to use that rest efficiently. Then the incomplete recovery becomes the condition you take back into the next day. What continues is not just tiredness, but a loop in which reduced recovery creates reduced capacity. and reduced capacity makes full recovery even harder to reach. As this state continues, it often begins to influence how you interpret yourself, not just how you feel. When energy remains low despite effort to rest, it can appear as if the problem is a lack of discipline or motivation. You may begin to question why simple tasks feel harder, or why your capacity seems lower than it used to be. This interpretation feels convincing because the external conditions do not fully explain the internal experience. From the outside, it may look like there is no clear reason for the fatigue, which makes it easy to attribute it to personal limitation. However, this conclusion overlooks the structure that is maintaining the exhaustion. The system is not lacking effort, but operating under reduced recovery and increased internal load. When this is not recognized, the response often becomes self-critical. You may try to push harder, expecting that effort will compensate for the lack of energy. This creates additional strain. Instead of restoring capacity, it increases the demand placed on an already fatigued system. This reinforces the cycle. The more you push, the more the system remains activated, and the less opportunity it has to recover. Over time, this pattern can reshape how you evaluate yourself, even though the issue is not a reflection of your ability, but of the system's current condition. When energy is already reduced, pushing harder often feels like a necessary response rather than a choice. Difficulty is interpreted as a signal that more effort is required, even when the underlying condition has already shifted. Movement can create a temporary sense of control, making it seem like progress is being made. Yet, beneath that surface, something different is happening. A system that has not recovered does not respond to effort in the same way as one that is fully restored. Instead of increasing output, added effort begins to draw from what little reserve remains. Strain builds quietly, not because the task is overwhelming, but because the capacity to handle it has been reduced. At that point, effort no longer functions as support. It becomes an additional demand layered on top of an already limited system. This is where the pattern turns. Trying to compensate for low energy by increasing output creates more internal pressure, which further delays recovery. Nothing about this process feels obvious in the moment. It often feels like persistence, discipline, or responsibility. However, the direction is misaligned. Energy is being spent to maintain function, rather than being preserved to restore capacity. A different perspective begins to emerge here. Instead of focusing on how to push through, attention shifts toward recognizing when the system is no longer in a state that benefits from added effort. That recognition changes how the next action is chosen. Recovery begins to change when attention shifts away from adding more and toward reducing what continues to drain energy. In a fatigued system, improvement does not come from increasing effort, but from removing the conditions that keep the system engaged. Much of this engagement is not obvious because it happens internally rather than through visible action. Ongoing mental processing, background tension, and subtle anticipation can all consume energy without appearing as work. Because these patterns feel normal, they are rarely questioned. Yet they are often what prevents recovery from fully taking place. Reducing these internal demands becomes more important than increasing external rest. This does not require eliminating all activity or achieving complete stillness. It begins with noticing when the system is continuing to process without a clear purpose. At that point, the change is not to solve the thought, but to stop extending it. Each moment where unnecessary processing is reduced creates space for the system to settle more deeply. This space is what allows recovery to begin. Without it, rest remains shallow, regardless of how much time is given. A useful way to approach this is by identifying what can be removed rather than what needs to be added. Less internal demand leads to more available capacity. Over time, this shift alters how energy is used and restored. Many of the patterns that keep energy low do not look serious on the surface, which is exactly why they are easy to miss. A mind that keeps reviewing conversations, anticipating future demands, or holding unfinished decisions in the background can remain active far longer than you realize. None of these processes may seem intense on their own, yet together they create a steady internal workload. Energy is spent not only on what you do, but also on what your system keeps carrying. Small forms of vigilance matter here. Checking mentally whether something has been forgotten, staying slightly prepared for interruption, or carrying a low level of emotional tension can all prevent deeper recovery. Because these habits are subtle, they are often mistaken for normal awareness or responsibility. Yet, responsibility that never powers down becomes strain. Another hidden drain appears in transition moments. When one task ends, the system does not always settle. It often moves immediately into the next thought, the next concern, or the next piece of internal processing. That constant continuation removes the gap where recovery would normally begin. A fatigued system is rarely exhausted only by large demands. More often, it is worn down by small forms of unfinished activation that continue all day. Recognizing these patterns matters because recovery does not begin when everything disappears. It begins when repeated internal demands stop being carried automatically. Reducing hidden sources of fatigue begins with identifying where continuation happens automatically. Many of these points are not obvious decisions, but habitual transitions where the system moves without pause. One of the most effective shifts is creating a clear boundary at the end of an internal process. When a thought has reached a point where no further action can be taken, allowing it to end becomes more important than refining it further. Without that boundary, the system continues to cycle through the same material, consuming energy without producing change. Another important adjustment appears in how you move between activities. Instead of carrying the previous task into the next one mentally, a brief pause can allow the system to reset. That pause does not need to be long. What matters is that it interrupts the automatic continuation that normally occurs. Attention is given a chance to settle before it is engaged again. A similar pattern applies to low-level vigilance. Not every possibility needs to be held in awareness at all times. Releasing the need to constantly check or anticipate reduces a significant portion of internal load. This does not reduce responsibility. It changes how that responsibility is carried. Each of these adjustments is small on its own, yet together they begin to reduce the background activity that prevents recovery. Energy is not restored through a single action, but through the consistent reduction of what continues unnecessarily. As these small reductions in internal demand begin to accumulate, a shift starts to occur in how the system manages energy. The change is not immediate or dramatic, but it becomes noticeable through the way fatigue begins to loosen rather than remain constant. Energy does not suddenly return in full. Instead, the system gradually regains its ability to settle more deeply between periods of activity. Moments of rest begin to feel slightly more effective, not because they are longer, but because the system is no longer carrying as much background load. This creates a different rhythm. Activation still happens, but it is followed by a more complete release. The gap between effort and recovery becomes clearer. Over time, this allows the baseline to shift. What once felt like a constant level of fatigue begins to break into smaller, more temporary experiences. You may notice that certain parts of the day feel lighter, or that recovery happens more quickly after mental effort. These changes are subtle, but they indicate that the system is beginning to function differently. Instead of remaining partially engaged all the time, it is learning how to fully disengage when nothing is required. This is what makes recovery possible. Not the absence of activity, but the presence of a system that knows how to return to a resting state. As the system begins to shift toward recovery, an unexpected reaction can appear. Moments of reduced tension may feel unfamiliar, sometimes even slightly uncomfortable, rather than immediately relieving. This reaction does not come from the absence of stress, but from the system adjusting to a state it has not experienced consistently. When activation has been present for a long time, it becomes associated with normal functioning. A quieter state can then feel uncertain, as if something is missing or not being monitored. Instead of registering as safety, stillness may be interpreted as a lack of control. This creates a subtle resistance. The system may attempt to return to familiar patterns, reintroducing small forms of mental activity or tension without a clear reason. This is not a conscious decision. It is a return to what feels known and predictable. Because of this, recovery does not always feel comfortable at first. There can be a period where the absence of strain feels less stable than the presence of it. Understanding this prevents misinterpretation. Discomfort in this phase does not mean something is wrong. It reflects a transition where the system is learning a different baseline. With enough consistency, what once felt unfamiliar begins to feel natural. Maintaining this shift requires a different kind of consistency than what is usually expected. The focus is not on maintaining a perfect state, but on recognizing when the system begins to return to its previous pattern. Those moments often appear quietly. A slight increase in internal pressure, a tendency to re-engage with unnecessary thinking, or a subtle return of background tension can signal that the system is moving back toward activation. Catching these early changes matters more than trying to correct the entire pattern at once. A small adjustment at the right moment prevents the need for a larger correction later. This is where stability begins to form. Instead of reacting only when fatigue becomes obvious, attention is placed on the smaller shifts that lead up to it. Over time, this builds a form of awareness that is not effortful, but responsive. Another important part of maintaining recovery is allowing fluctuation. Energy will not remain constant, and periods of lower capacity will still appear. Interpreting those moments correctly prevents the system from returning to old responses. A temporary drop in energy does not mean the process has failed. It means the system is still adjusting. Consistency is not about holding a fixed state. It is about returning to the same principle each time the pattern begins to reappear. At the center of this experience is not a lack of rest, but a system that has not fully returned to a state where recovery is possible. Fatigue persists not because you have failed to pause, but because the conditions required for restoration have not been consistently met. Once this becomes clear, the focus shifts in a more precise direction. Energy is not restored by adding more time away from activity, but by reducing what continues to keep the system engaged during that time. This distinction changes how the entire problem is approached. Instead of asking how to rest more, the question becomes how to allow the system to actually settle. A practical way to understand this is through one consistent reference point. Whenever internal activity continues without a clear purpose, energy is being used without contributing to recovery. Recognizing those moments creates an opportunity, not to solve them, but to stop extending them. Each time that extension is interrupted, the system moves slightly closer to a state where recovery can occur. Over time, these small shifts accumulate. Fatigue begins to lose its constant presence, not because it is forced away, but because the structure maintaining it is no longer reinforced. What returns is not just energy, but the ability for the system to reset. That ability is what makes rest effective again.